Welcome to the South Australian Drought Hub podcast, strengthening drought resilience for our farmers and regional communities.
After an unseasonably wet summer, it's come in dry, and now many producers will have their stock in containment. That then brings up the question of when to let stock out for lambing. It's an important decision, and it's determined by a range of considerations, such as, has it rained? Is there ground cover? And if it hasn't rained, can you lamb in containment? G'day, I'm Drew Radford, and to answer these questions and more, I'm joined for this SA Drought Hub podcast by Deb Scammell from Talking Livestock and also Josh Hancock, a sheep producer at RL Hancock Sons in Reedy Creek near Lucindale. Thank you both for your time.
That's okay.
No worries.
Josh and Deb, holding stock in containment is something both of you have a reasonable amount of experience with.
Yeah, so I'm basically a livestock consultant. I've been running my own business for 5 years. Before that, I spent 10 years working for a commercial nutrition company, predominantly working with livestock producers. I've sort of fallen into doing a lot of work in the livestock containment space. So I ran a 3-year MLA project when I first sort of started in my own business, where we followed a lot of containment sites through. So have fine-tuned it and now, just do a lot of containment feeding with my own clients, but also work on a lot of projects sort of looking at improving containment feeding and avoiding health issues, and recently just upskilling some other people to consult in the same area.
Well, certainly the right background to be talking this topic with. And Josh, can you give us a bit of an overview of your operation?
So we're predominantly a sheep-run business on about 3,000 acres down in the southeast, not too far from the coast. Was originally a self-replacing merino business, but when I came home, we did some sums, and down here it wasn't really paying for us. So we've branched into crossbreds. Now run a mixed flock with about 1,000 merino ewes to produce first cross ewe lambs with a Border Leicester. And then we're putting Dorset and White Suffolk rams over those first cross ewes and producing as many crossbred lambs as we can. And in our recent time, the push here in our business is just to try and get more out of less. We don't want to run things too hard, but we want to be as efficient and as productive as we can with what we've got.
Deb, the summer that's just been, a bit of a helicopter view. What have you been seeing in terms of livestock and containment over South Australia, and particularly as summer's wound up and we're into autumn?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting season. I always feel like no 2 seasons are the same, but this one's thrown a lot of curveballs. So probably starting in the cropping areas with fairly low nutritional value in a lot of the stubbles. So we've had a fairly short sort of grazing period on stubbles. And then when you look at dry feed and stubbles in other areas, we ended up with quite a lot of summer rainfall, which unfortunately, was too early and too hot. So it hasn't actually helped feed quality. It's just deteriorated a lot of that dry feed. So I've probably seen stock coming into autumn probably a little bit behind the 8 ball as far as conditions. So they're probably back a bit on what we want. And then the feeds run out very quickly. So, most producers I'm finding are having a substantial quantity of supplementary feed going into livestock at the moment.
So, Josh, what have you seen in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, down here in the southeast, it's been a bit of an interesting run too. We finished with a very poor or late spring at the end of last year, which meant, there was less bulk feed from that spring flush, not as much hay or fodder cut, and it's probably hasn't set us up for a late start this year. We didn't get a lot of the summer rain Deb talked about, so in terms of paddock feed quality, I don't think we've probably suffered the losses that some of the northern areas have, but we definitely don't have tons of feed on the ground either. So what we've got, I don't think, probably is as poor as in some other areas, but there's just not the quantity.
Deb, we're into May and a lot of people have probably got pregnant ewes in containment at the moment. What are the considerations then about letting them out?
Yeah, so I guess when I talk about this, I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 different enterprises. So, there's quite a lot of autumn lambers that, when we get through to the mallee, there's a lot of people that have already lambed. So I guess the issues we've had this year is we just haven't had the bulk feed to let them out on. Even our mid to late autumn lambers are starting to put use out on paddocks now, and generally would prefer a bit of green feed or something of quality, where we're pretty much just putting them out in paddocks with whatever dry feed was retained from last spring. And as Josh mentioned, most areas just didn't have the bulk feed going into spring. So I guess we're letting them out of containment through necessity because of lambing time, not because of having adequate feed on offer, which means there's a lot of supplementary feeding sort of going on in some cases relatively bare paddocks or really depleted stubbles. When we then look at, later lambers, I guess a lot of people are holding them into after the break just because we're trying to let that break happen, feed come through, and then we will be targeting sort of higher feed on offer and high nutritional quality around lambing. But yeah, for the autumn lambers, it's been a really tough season because you haven't been able to make the decision. They've just had to go out, basically.
Josh, with what you've been through over summer and the poor finish last year, have you had stock in containment?
Yeah, so we've been containing sheep for about 3 years. This is the third season. This year we've got more in than we normally would. In the last couple of years, we've been lucky and got early starts down here in the southeast, and I've made the decision only to containment feed twin-bearing ewes. But this year, the writing was on the wall pretty early that it was going to be tough through April and May here. Just there wasn't enough feed left on the ground. And so I made that early decision that we'd just confinement feed both singles and twins on these two properties here. So I currently have 1,000 twins and 600 singles in confinement that we're feeding.
That would be keeping you busy, no doubt.
Yeah, it does, but I think it's actually nowhere near as bad as it sounds. I think the efficiencies of labour are a lot better in confinement. You're not chasing mobs right around your farm. They're all in one location. Your hay stack, silage stack, and your grain bins, as long as you set it up appropriately, can all be right there. And so we find that labour units and time-wise, we can feed 1,600 sheep in, just a few hours. It's nowhere near as bad as driving around the whole farm looking for them.
And on that question of lambing, Deb, how close to lambing can you keep the sheep in containment?
Yeah, and this is a real individual sort of decision. It depends a lot on how far stock are going into a lambing paddock. So, when it's dry and they're not going through a huge feed change, like they're going to be in supplement anyway in the lambing paddock, you can really go up to a week prior to lambing. But when you're looking at twins and things, and especially if they're going to be trucked or walked some sort of distance, I prefer to let them out kind of a month prior. And, in an ideal world for late lambers, we'll have green feed, and then you need to worry about that sort of adjustment back to a different feed type. So my preference would be 3 to 4 weeks, but in seasons like this, I've probably got producers more going that 7 to 10 days prior to lambing, really dependent on distance and stress to get them back to their lambing paddocks.
That begs the question, Josh, do you have a plan for when you'll be releasing your stock from containment?
Yeah, so we're going to break Deb's rule. In years gone by, when we've managed to grow a bit of a wedge, ideally I've been trying to get them out a fortnight before lambing. We don't use teasers or anything I use, so the first week of lambing, it's not real heavy. So the majority of our lambs fall from the second week on. This year, with not having the feed wedge that we've had, I'm going to go probably back to that sort of 7 to 10 days and get them back into the paddock then. But, we manage that as good as we can. We're set up with laneways, count the sheep out of the paddocks into their lambing mobs and just let them dawdle back basically to the paddock they're going to lamb in. So we just try and manage it as stress-free as possible.
Josh, does that require adaptation to different seasonal conditions?
If we were to have earlier rain, so late April, early May rain, and grow a really good feed wedge, I basically go out and assess paddocks that I've got set up ready for lambing. And once I have that wedge there, then there's the ability to turn sheep out of the confinement system a bit earlier. But in saying that, last year we had quite a good start down here in the southeast, and I got greedy and left them in. I had the feed put aside to feed them up until a certain date in the confinement system. And I've just found here on our particular enterprise and farm, the bigger the wedge I can get ahead of my ewes to lamb in, the better my lambing results will be. So even in a really good start, I've been tempted to keep them in confinement and only bring them out in that fortnight prior to lambing, purely out of the fact that the bigger the wedge I can grow, I know the better my lambing will be for that season.
We'll turn to you, Deb. Are there health problems that develop if you keep stock in containment for longer than usual?
Yeah, so I guess when we look at feeding supplementary feed, a lot of it is that imbalance with what you're giving. I find a lot of containment feeding rations rely a lot on just hay, straw, and cereal grain. So what we often find is calcium's a major issue where we can suffer sort of with hypocalcemia as we basically end up with reduced calcium stores in the ewes as they draw on it sort of through pregnancy, but also things like vitamin A and E that often get out of green feed, and it really is over that 2 to 3 month mark. So if they've been supplementary fed or on dry feed for more than 2 to 3 months, you need to look at those vitamin levels too. It pretty much is the imbalance, and I always push as a nutritionist that does a lot of containment rations, basically everything that you can access is within that ration. So, if they are in there for a long period of time, your mineral balance, but also making sure you're sort of hitting protein targets, that you'll get lambs to the correct birth weight, and any deficiency in energy, you're going to be losing condition score. And we also see with some of our feeding methods, people will end up with 10 or 20% tail sort of in their ewes, and so they'll end up just way behind condition score targets. So it is really just being very pedantic about nutrition and what they could be missing.
Deb, if the dry conditions continue for the next month or so, will some farmers be tempted or attempt to lamb their ewes in containment?
Yeah, an interesting question, and one I sort of get asked regularly is, can we lamb in containment? And the difficult thing is, I'm looking at lambing paddocks at the moment, and some of them are nearly as bare as the containment pens. But what you imagine with the containment pens is those ewes have sat in those pens for, months on end. There's often worm burdens, there can be disease sort of in the soil in that area. So my preference is, even if you do need to lamb in a smaller area, I'd prefer to move them to a different area, and it needs to be sort of bigger than a traditional containment pen. So I've had farmers in drought sort of successfully fence off, say, a scrub area, but it might be sort of 3 to 4 acres rather than your traditional sort of acre containment pen, because the ewes still basically need privacy to lamb in, and we want to get them onto fresh ground, even if it's dusty, just so they're not dropping in that sort of disease risk area where the ewes have been running.
Deb, even when the rains arrive, is there still an argument for keeping stock in containment because pasture doesn't grow immediately?
We're very stuck with autumn lambers at the moment, because I'm looking, once we get a break, it's 4 to 6 weeks before you get any decent pasture out of the ground. And in the mid-north area where I work, a lot of people are sowing dry at the moment. So you imagine it's still got to germinate and turn into something decent. It's going to be end of June before we see anything. So I think holding them in later is fine, but yeah, we're really running out of time. If you're a July lammer, you're potentially going to have time to hold them in a bit later, let the feed get away, and then still put them onto a feed wedge like Josh sort of talked about. But yeah, for June, we're being pushed with decision making around putting them somewhere to lamb, not necessarily having the advantage of feed growing.
That feed wedge must be particularly important, though, because you just can't open the gate. It's just significant change in diet.
Yeah, so that's one of the considerations when, in a very normal season where we are putting them out onto grain feed, you've basically got all these microbes in the rumen. So when we get them onto that hay grain diet, they sort of start to be more starch digesting, and they're digesting hay successfully. And then it is a real upset to the rumen to suddenly put them out onto green feed that'll go really quickly through them. And the unfortunate part is, even though we want the ewes to stay on hay and grain, if you have very good quality pasture or quite lush sown cereals and things, what you see is they just chase that green pick around the paddock, and we can see issues with sort of preg tox and things just because they've gone off the feed. So my preference is to adjust them to the new feed type gradually. In a standard sort of year where we have an earlier break, I've got producers that will successfully sort of move them in and out of containment over that sort of 10 to 14 days, or following them with the supplementary feed can help slightly once they get over that initial sort of running around on green feed. I guess we talk about introducing to grain and hay over sort of 10 to 14 days. So, the aim is that you're going to go back the other way and introduce that new feed type just as gradually to allow those rumen microbes to sort of change over.
Deb, lastly on health, actually moving them out later, is it a particularly stressful thing?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the problem I always get these calls about in a year like this where people are sort of holding them in, hoping for a rain. But especially when you look at, say, twin bearing ewes, if they've got to walk a bit of a distance or go on a truck, that stress around lambing, and as they're getting quite close, we do often see issues like hypocalcemia, which comes from your calcium deficiency during that period. You know, you can end up with large numbers of ewes sort of dropping with issues like that, and also things like pregnancy toxemia. So, you know, even a short time off feed and movement can have an impact on those twin bearing ewes, as it's associated with sort of stress as well.
Josh, you've mentioned your third year in a row that you've done containment. Have you encountered any problems with letting stock out?
No, so the first 2 years we did it, we managed to have good years and grew really nice feed wedges ahead of the stock before coming out. I think in those 2 years we probably tested the system pretty well because they went into, like Deb said, quite high quality and quite a good quantity of green pick. But I had the intention in the first year of introducing them, like Deb said, like letting them out for a few hours each day and slowly getting them onto that green pick. But the reality of doing that, it was a lot of work, and unless your containment system is set up in a location that is very easy to let, you know, pen at a time out onto a paddock of nice green pick, it's quite hard to manage that. And so what we did is we actually let them out into their paddocks, into that feed, but we had set up feeding rings and continued to trail feed grain in the paddock where they were set up to lamb. And so we basically fed the continuation of the ration they'd been on in the pen the week or 2 weeks leading up to that lambing date. And then at the point of lambing, then we ceased to feed anymore. So we just tried to keep their diet happening like it had been in the pen. And because they're so trained to going to the bales and hearing a motorbike or a tractor, we've found that they do continue to come to the feed even though they do have that green pick to chase. So for us, that's worked. We haven't had any trouble in the last 2 years gone by. So I hope that strategy keeps working for us going forward.
Josh, what are the pros and cons that farmers in your area encounter around containment?
There's not a lot of farmers just directly in my area going down the confinement feeding line yet. I guess in the southeast, we haven't been forced into it because of drought feeding or anything like that. It's probably been more pushed through production, people who are trying to increase productivity used through nutrition and better feeding. And so really, I haven't got a lot of other cockies down here that I can talk to about what their opinion is. But from our point of view, the pros are to maintain ground cover in our paddocks. So like, even though we haven't had a really good break here yet, we've still got dry feed cover from the spring. So I've got feed to turn sheep out into. Whereas if I'd had them out there in the last 6 weeks, we would now be pretty bare. We can match our nutrition to the ewe requirements and to the ewe and what she's rearing in terms of whether she's a single or a twin. And that lets us get our lamb birth weights up to a much better target. I think we reduced the energy wastage by sheep just walking around a paddock chasing blades of dry feed that don't actually have a lot of quality left in them. So, you know, the supplementary feeding we're doing, that energy's not being wasted walking around a paddock. They literally sit in the shade and walk to the bale of hay and have a feed, and walk to the trough and have a drink, and they go and sit down again. So I think the efficiencies of the energy that they're eating is much better. The labour efficiency for us in feeding is way better than driving all around the farm feeding at this time of the year. The reality is, if we weren't feeding in containment like we are, we should be feeding them the same in the paddock because the feed quality in the paddock is not great. And so everything I'm feeding in those pens should be getting carted out to them in the paddock if they're out there. So I think it's easier for us labour-wise to feed them in one spot. I think we reduce feed wastage in the pens because we're set up in ways that stop from spoiling it, whereas, you know, often in the paddock you'll just trail feed or run a bale of hay out or whatever and they end up trampling on most of it, whereas in the pens it's set up better than that. And then it's just that ability for us to grow a feed wedge ready for lambing so that our ewes come out of the pens in the ideal condition, going into an ideal scenario to lamb in, and that just sets them up then to do the best job they can for the lambs for that season. Cons-wise, I think the biggest thing for me, and having done it for 3 years now, is that it needs to be managed well. So, you know, if you're going to go down the line of confinement feeding, you obviously have to be able to feed budget, and you have to have the availability of feed. It's no good having 1,600 sheep in pens and realising you don't have a big enough haystack or silage or grain on hand. So I think it does have to be managed well. You need to understand what the sheep require and what you need to make it happen, and also just monitoring all your animal health issues that you can have along the way and making sure that you're around classes of stock that maybe shouldn't go in and reducing any problems you might have health-wise. But we haven't seen a lot of negatives. It's been all pretty positive, but I think you definitely have to manage it. You can't just go blindly into it.
Deb, any last points you'd like those listening to this to take away about letting stock out from containment?
Yeah, I guess realistically when you're letting them out, it's just having a bit of a plan around how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it. And, I think realistically working just on pastures, as we've seen the last 5 years, there's just been such a change as to when that break has come. So in an ideal world, we'd have our 1,000 or 1,500 kilos of feed on offer and we'd let the ewes out and give them that adjustment period. But I think, specifically in dry areas where they're autumn lambing, I think we just need to have those backup options. So, I've seen people fence lambing areas that they can use in a dry year. I've got others that'll electric fence off a corner of a sown paddock so they're not walking around chasing short pick for months, but they can let them out sort of once the feeds come through. So yeah, I think just having that backup option that, you need to have them out a couple of weeks prior, so you've got to have somewhere that they're going to go.
Josh and Deb, you've given some great insights from a lot of time spent working in this particular area. For now, though, Deb Scammell from Talking Livestock and also Josh Hancock from RL Hancock Sons, thank you both for joining me for this SA Drought Hub podcast.
Thanks, Drew.
Thanks, Drew.
And that concludes this podcast. You'll find more podcasts on the SA Drought Hub website at sadroughthub.com.au. The South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub is one of 8 hubs established across the nation through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. The SA Drought Hub is an exciting initiative which brings together a dynamic network of primary producers, industry groups, researchers, government agencies, universities, agribusinesses, farming systems groups, traditional owners and others to work towards a common vision to strengthen the drought resilience and preparedness of farms and regional communities in SA. Led by the University of Adelaide in partnership with the Department of Primary Industries and Regions South Australia, the Hub is responsible for driving the extension of existing knowledge and practices to build drought resilience in primary production systems.